If you're watching this, you should be coming from part 1 of this study. This is part 2 of a 2-part video on why there are so many Bible translations today. And unless you're already familiar with this subject, there's some crucial information from part 1 you'll need to understand, so you may need to go back and start from there. Okay. In part 1, we ended at the point in history that led to the critical text, which came after the Textus Receptus. So now is a great time to discuss the textual criticism behind these documents, and that's what we'll do now. While discussing textual criticism, we only need to focus on those 2 documents, the Textus Receptus and the critical text, the 2 Greek texts used to produce the New Testaments of all major English translations. Again, these 2 texts are basically rivals in the battle of the Bible translations, and how anyone decided which text to favor was by using textual criticism. Of course, when Westcott and Hort published their Greek New Testament, the critical text, they obviously had to have reasons on why anyone should reject the already accepted and trusted Textus Receptus. And all of this falls under textual criticism. So what is textual criticism? The definition says, the process of attempting to ascertain the original wording of a text. And ascertain just means to find something out for certain, to make sure of. So, it's the process of attempting to find for certain the original wording of a text. So it's basically the process of looking at all the evidence to determine the original wording of documents that were copied. And you can probably imagine how excruciating that process could be. It's truly scholarly work, and I'm not here to try to attempt to break down the entire process. I just want to point out certain rules and methods that scholars use for supporting each text, the Textus Receptus and the critical text. This process of textual criticism is of course used when looking at any historical document, but we're talking specifically about the differences in the New Testaments of our English Bibles, so we're directly referring to the Greek manuscripts. To understand this, I'll only speak about 2 theories used when textually criticizing the manuscripts. The first being what's called the majority text theory. Simply put, they look at all the manuscripts we have, and when there is a textual variant, they look for the version that has support among the majority of manuscripts. Makes sense, but we know that the majority doesn't always mean correct. While this process seems simple, they do take more of a mathematical approach, and when using this process, it produces a New Testament that's identical with what the church used since the 4th century. Now the Textus Receptus follows a different theory, but the text itself aligns very well with the text produced by the majority text theory. Now the critical text theory uses their own rules to decide what was added or removed. One major rule was their belief that an older manuscript holds more weight than the majority. And this is a major reason for the newer critical text. Westcott and Hort used 2 of the earliest manuscripts we have. Manuscripts that Erasmus and others did not have possession of when they assembled the New Testament. In the 19th century, they had discovered manuscripts that predate the ones we had in the 16th century. The 2 most famous ones being Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, being the oldest completed manuscript we have. Now there's a lot more to that, and not every scholar finds this oldest manuscript to be the most authentic, but we can at least say they have an argument at the least. And this is the major difference between the Textus Receptus and the critical text. The Textus Receptus is older, was trusted more longer, and aligns with the majority text, while the critical text, although later, has support from the oldest manuscripts we have. This video is not to convince you which side to join. If anything, this video is to urge you to consider both sides because it's worth it. However, to be transparent, I personally favor the reading of the Textus Receptus. I don't believe one older manuscript should rule over the majority. However, anything older is worth considering. I'm just against anyone saying the Textus Receptus is outdated or based on corrupted manuscripts. That hasn't been proven by anyone. I'm also against categorizing the critical text as a satanic text and attacking it. It just all seems a little too extreme, considering when you actually look at the differences, they aren't that problematic anyways. Again, these are not different Bibles, but this is a split that exists, and the differences are worth noting. This is actually the main split between English Bibles, whether the Greek text derives from the Textus Receptus or the critical text. Older translations like the King James Version and New King James Version use the Textus Receptus. Another translation I use that predates the King James Version is the Geneva Version or Geneva Bible. That's also translated from the Textus Receptus. The critical text is used to translate the New Testaments of modern translations like the New International Version, the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, and the New Living Translation, just to name some. Okay, so now you're probably thinking, we get it. There are mainly two different Greek documents that translators choose from. But what exactly are the differences between these texts? And please, do not be deceived. Do not be fooled and do not be baited. When you hear someone going off about the hundreds of thousands textual variants and on about how we can't trust the Bible and it was corrupted and changed, just remember that over 99% of all those variants are meaningless. Numerous spelling, grammar, and word order errors. For example, Romans chapter 1 verse 1. This is considered a textual variant, and there are tons like this. We already went over a couple examples of textual variants in part 1, but let's break down some more of them. In Matthew chapter 17, we have a missing verse, or an added verse depending on which Greek text you hold to. The older Bibles based on the Textus Receptus include this verse that modern Bibles of the critical text exclude because this verse is not in any early manuscripts, they say. So what's the verse? Matthew 17 verse 21. It says, "However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." For context, in Matthew 17, a man comes to Jesus asking him to cure his son that previously some of the disciples tried and couldn't. After Jesus cured the boy, the disciples came back asking Jesus why they couldn't cast out the demon. And Jesus replied, because of their faith. He added that if they had faith, even as a mustard seed, that anything would be possible for them. Then in the King James and New King James Version, for example, verse 21 says, "However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." Versions like the NIV and ESV, two translations of the critical text, both exclude this verse. So what's going on here? Did someone add this verse or remove it? And what's their motive? First, let's just assume the worst, that some scribe took it upon himself to add this verse, it got copied, then we all read and believed it for centuries. Let's assume the critical text is correct, and this verse is not a part of the original text. Because if someone took that verse out, let's say to hide the truth about the power and importance of prayer and fasting, then they did a horrible job, because they accidentally kept all the other verses about the importance and power of prayer and fasting. Or maybe someone removed this verse because it implied the disciples could cast out the demons if they prayed or fast enough. And this person didn't want us to know that. Well, the disciples were already casting out demons and doing miracles even without that verse, so they did a bad job again. But the case is the same in reverse. Why would someone add this verse? To trick us into believing that prayer and fasting is important? I mean, why else, right? But here's why that would be useless and why it makes no difference if this verse is removed or not. We're in Matthew chapter 17, a long way down this gospel. And 11 chapters earlier in Matthew 6, Jesus in the middle of his Sermon on the Mount is teaching multitudes how to pray, saying when you pray, do this and do that. And then right after, he immediately speaks about fasting, saying when you fast, do this and do that. Jesus already made known the importance of prayer and fasting, and these passages are in all the translations, all the manuscripts. And also get this, in the Gospel of Mark chapter 9, this same story is recorded, and in verse 29, Jesus does tell the disciples that this kind only goes out by prayer, and that's agreed in all the translations, although they still debate if he said prayer and fasting at that time. But it's definitely true throughout the rest of Scripture that fasting is good and powerful. So does this variant in Matthew chapter 17 exist? Yes. Does it corrupt the Bible? No. And the fact that we can see this variant shows the honesty of our scholars and scribes. They didn't just choose the version they wanted and burn the rest. Here's another one. Jesus is telling the parable in Matthew chapter 20, and at the end of the parable in verse 16, Jesus says, "So the last will be first and the first will be last." That's the critical text. But in the Textus Receptus, it adds, "For many are called, but few are chosen," to the end of the verse. Now, it is problematic if some scribes wrote that Jesus said, "Many are called, but few are chosen," when he actually never said that. I mean, that's something I believed and quoted often. And if someone removed those words, then they're robbing us of something important Jesus meant to tell us. Which is it? But before we even have to worry about that, or why this variant even exists, there's another verse that ensures us that this variant honestly makes no difference at all. The verse is Matthew 22, verse 14. What does it say? Well, Jesus is speaking again, and he says, "For many are called, but few are chosen." The same exact words in the same gospel. And this verse is in every translation, both Greek texts. So adding this phrase or verse in Matthew 20 wouldn't be attributing words to Jesus he never said. And removing this phrase or verse from Matthew 20 wouldn't stop us from knowing it. This one verse in question makes no difference to our knowledge, understanding, salvation, relationship, or anything. Does this variant exist? Yes. Does it change or corrupt the Bible? No. And that's all that matters about variants. Does it change the meaning? Does it corrupt the text? Does it add or remove any doctrine? And if not, someone can cry 100,000 variants all they want. It makes no difference until they show us one that makes a difference. How about this one? Romans chapter 16 verse 24 says, "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen." That's the King James Version of the Textus Receptus. But this is another missing verse in the critical text. The modern translations exclude it. Do you see what's going on here? This is a letter written to the Church of Rome, and the scribes are debating if the writer really prayed the grace of Jesus be with the church. Really? Understand, the question is not, for example, if Jesus is Lord. This entire book attests to that in all the translations. The question is not if grace comes from Jesus. These are all doctrines we know from elsewhere in the Bible. Again, supported by all the translations. The scribes here are being so precise in trying to recover the exact words of these manuscripts, and people dare use that honesty against them? You're telling me Christians, believers, are debating whether the writer of Romans prayed the grace of Jesus on the church or not? Like, how much more noble can you get? And why would any believer want to deny that? Unless simply to keep the integrity and accuracy of the text, which is the opposite of corrupting it. Imagine that, keeping records of all the evidence and variants, even the inconsequential ones, and being labeled corrupt for that. And there are many, many more examples just like these. This is what 99% of all variants look like. Missing verses, added verses, different texts, different Bibles. But are these really different Bibles? Okay, so now we understand the main difference that divides our Bible translations. That's the textual variants in the manuscripts and how scholars textually criticize each group of manuscripts. That's what caused different translators to choose one reading over the other in places where the texts differ. But as I stated earlier, there's another reason for different readings among our Bibles, and that reason is the philosophy behind the translation. In other words, it depends whether the translation is based on a formal equivalence or dynamic equivalence. Let's define them. Formal equivalence is a translation approach that aims to translate a text as close to the original as possible, as close to a word-for-word translation to preserve the original grammatical structures. Dynamic equivalence is an approach that focuses on conveying the original meaning and intent of a text in a way that's more natural and clear to a modern reader, even if it requires changing the wording and sentence structure. This has proven to be helpful most of the time, but this kind of liberty can be misused. Now I'm going to keep this short and simple. Formal is more word for word, and dynamic is more thought for thought. Anything beyond that becomes paraphrase, and when building theology, you must stay away from paraphrases. Here is a graphic of popular Bible translations and roughly where they stand on a scale from word for word to paraphrase. Check it out and see where your favorite translation falls. My only advice is if you read translations that are paraphrases, and even some thought for thought, do it for the readability and not theology. In other words, before you take the translation literally and start teaching Bible principles based on it, at least consult other translations of a more formal equivalence. Whether you agree with the received text or critical text, you have more formal translations for each text. In defense of thought-for-thought translations, while word-for-word is usually best, the concern is that sometimes this method can sacrifice clarity or readability and make it difficult for modern readers to understand. People usually say they can understand the New International Version or New Living Translation more than the older translations. And that's good, but here's an example that I believe illustrates well how each method can be helpful but also concerning. I heard this example on a podcast not too long ago. In Revelation 3:20, Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." And one guy shares that he remembers hearing about a certain tribe of people, and in their culture, knocking was negative. It was what thieves did. In that culture, a person would cough or clear their throat to signify their arrival instead of knocking, right? So reading that verse is alarming to them. It's like, is Jesus a thief? And I believe to make them understand, it was translated for them, "Behold, I stand at the door and cough." That's an example of dynamic equivalence. It changes the wording, but to help convey the meaning to modern or different cultures. That example is innocent and understandable. My problem, however, is that it's only a temporary fix, and they would need to make time and energy to explain the original meaning in this example and not allow the original meaning to get lost in the translation. That tribe would have to understand what knocking in the culture of the original writer and audience meant, and not just what it means from their perspective. Sure, we can explain it in their terms, but say one of the kids in that tribe grows up and starts looking into other translations or the original language and sees, "Behold, I knock." It's definitely understandable for that person to believe that what they stumbled across is corruption. And they have every right to believe that what they were taught their whole life was a lie, because these ancient documents prove it. All because they were never explained the true meaning, original meaning, and that his translation was a thought-for-thought translation. One more example is in Luke 9, verse 44. Jesus says this phrase, "Let these words sink into your ears." And while I think everyone should know what that means, it's a little weird and not exactly an English phrase like how it's used in the Greek. This is a more word-for-word translation. Look at the English Standard Version and the New International Version, for example. Both of these use the same Greek text and manuscripts. But if you remember on our scale, the ESV The English Standard Version was more word for word, and the NIV, New International Version, was more thought for thought. The ESV retained this wording of the verse. But how would that phrase be said today? The NIV helps make it more modern and says, "Listen carefully to what I'm about to say." Totally different words, same meaning. This is the basics of formal equivalence versus dynamic equivalence versus paraphrases. It's helpful, but sometimes it's the very obstacle you need to overcome for a better, more accurate understanding. This is especially important for exposing the heretical versions that use this liberty to change the meaning of a verse drastically. How do we know? Well, we simply compare it to the Greek or Hebrew it was written in. That's almost always the solution. With as many more points there are to make and endless examples to study, I think it's reasonable to say we will save those for another time. Okay, so what's the takeaway of this study? How could we sum all of this up? For one, there are so many Bible translations because our scholars and scribes stayed faithful to all the manuscript evidence we have. Anything being hand copied by multiple men at different times will have textual variants. Yes, there are numerous variants. We can't deny them, but don't be scared of them. You'll find out that only under 1% of all variants anyone will bring up are worth noting. And even then, there are still no doctrinal changes due to these variants. As time went on, the dominant language of certain areas changed. But in the 15th century, there was a resurgence of Greek in the West. And since then, the textual criticism of the Greek manuscripts shaped the translations we have today. The popular translations we have today are usually split into two groups: King James Version versus the modern translations. King James being based on the Textus Receptus and modern translations based on the critical text. Besides all of that, we must consider whether a translation is more word for word, thought for thought, or paraphrased. There is no perfect translation. Remember, the Bible is not perfect, it's preserved. When you look at the evidence and use the resources available to us, it can really build your faith. I believe we have enough to be sure, but we aren't meant to know everything. Because these differences exist, there is no one translation I would recommend someone for life. Young believers may need a thought-for-thought translation for readability, but as they grow, I would definitely suggest studying other translations, especially those of a more formal equivalence. But if you want to be theological, you must outgrow paraphrased translations. That's a must. English can at times add confusion, so look into the original language for clarity. And no, the Bible was never changed. If it was, we wouldn't have all this history to trace so easily. I pray this encouraged someone today. I know many people today like to make claims that they never even looked into themselves, and I came across many claiming the Bible's corrupted just because the manuscripts are not 100% identical, and most of them couldn't even name one variant. They're following a script, some of them purposely spreading confusion to taint the truth. So I hope this study prevents even one new or young believer from falling victim due to lack of awareness. If this video has helped you at all, if you learned anything new or endorsed this information, hit the like button. Share this video with anyone it may help right now. And for more videos defending all things pertaining to the way, subscribe to this channel. Until next time, be blessed.